In 2010, five neuroscientists took a kayaking trip along the San Juan River in the remote part of southern Utah. And this trip was organized by Dr. David Strayer, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Utah. And he wanted to know what would it be like to step out into silence without the possibility of an electronic signal and free from the nagging awareness of a cell phone in the pocket. And Strayer invited three neuroscientist friends to join him on the expedition. One who shared his concern that ubiquitous communication is undermining our capacity for deep thinking and attention, and two friends who were skeptical. The two skeptics, including Dr. Todd Braver, came along for a fun vacation and to humor Strayer. But as Matt Richtel reported for his New York Times article about the trip, they are not convinced that anything lasting will come of the trip, personally or scientifically. In addition to recording their frequent debates, Matt Richtel of the New York Times also took pictures, and here is some video footage where he's explaining about the expedition.
I'm here today to participate in and report on a pretty interesting trip.
It's a trip involving neuroscientists
going into the wild. These are guys who study the brain and our capacity to focus, and on this trip looking both at their own capacities to focus, how their own attention works when they get away from email and phone and the city and life. What I expect to happen in this trip, at least based on the science, is that there'll be a little bit less fragmentation in how we think and even how we talk, and maybe there'll be a little bit more silence. I'm going to be looking for little changes and little moments, instances that underscore the emerging science about attention, and try to illustrate that for our readers.
One of the things that was so interesting about this trip is, as I mentioned before, Matt Richtel from the New York Times, he recorded their constant debates. And one of Strayer's skeptical friends, the neuroscience researcher Arthur Kramer, under whom Strayer actually earned his doctorate, he is constantly connected. And he has a colleague who complains that he goes to he takes his computer and goes on it during meetings. But Kramer remains confident that multitasking hasn't weakened his attention. But Strayer, who organized the expedition, isn't convinced. As they stopped for gas, just before they launched out, and Arthur Kramer checked his email one last time, Strayer remarked that his friend showed all the classic signs of addiction. And when the group finally put out on the San Juan River, they shared that silence descended because there were no more texts, emails, or notifications, just miles of beautiful scenery, like you saw in the video just now, and occasionally animals. And it seemed that being in nature against the backdrop of stillness spurred the group's creativity, leading to challenging discussions. One of the scientists, Stephen Yantes, suggested that the real significance of digital omnipresence might not be the actual interruptions coming from our devices, so much as our constant readiness to be interrupted at any moment. And Yantes, who's chairman of the at the time was chairman of the psychological and brain science department at Johns Hopkins, he remarked the expectation of email seems to be taking up working memory. Now this was in 2010, so now it's not just email, it's notifications, it's text messages, it's status updates, it's alerts. We were bombarded. Our working memory is bombarded with this cognitive load coming from so many different digital sources. And his remark really gets to the heart of Strayer's concern when he organized the trip. Strayer wanted to know, is our working memory the part of our brain that regulates attention, in addition to also being responsible for integrating ideas with past knowledge is a compromise, not just from the actual interruptions that come to us from our phones, but also by the anticipation of what might be coming down the digital pipeline. And you can see I put here on the screen what Matt Richtel wrote in the New York Times article about this. These researchers are wondering whether attention and focus can take a hit when people merely anticipate the arrival of more digital stimulation. Working memory is a precious resource in the brain. The scientists hypothesize that a fraction of brain power is tied up in anticipating email and other new information. The trip didn't yield any great epiphanies for the cautious scientists. Apart from them agreeing on strategies for how the various hypotheses they explored could be clinically tested. Yet, the time on the gentle river, free from all distractions, did seem to leave all of them, even the more technologically sanguine, with a new openness to quiet, and even boredom. And when Todd Braver, a psychology professor at Washington University in St. Louis, when he finally retrieved his phone, he said it dawned on him how much he turns to it in tiny moments of boredom. Sometimes I do use it as an excuse to be antisocial, he said. And after the wilderness excursion, all of them seemed to be more willing to consider that stillness and even boredom may have some benefits. But perhaps the most telling part of the experience was that Arthur Kramer, the skeptic of the group, seemed willing to rethink his relationship to multitasking. In the New York Times article about the trip, we read that as they near the airport, Mr. Kramer also mentions a personal discovery. I have a colleague who says that I'm being very impolite when I pull out the computer during meetings. I say I can listen. Maybe I'm not listening so well. Maybe I can work at being more engaged. Now that insight challenges us as students. Can we be more engaged? Are we only giving half our attention to our studies, to the lectures, to our readings and so forth? Are we reading class material while there are distractions in the same room, or just a click of the button away? But the reason that I shared about that trip, and we're going to circle back to that at the end of this presentation, because I contacted one of the scientists to ask what he had learned in the 15 years since then. But the reason I shared that is because of the tantalizing suggestion that perhaps it's not just actual interruptions that are putting a drain on our working memory, but the um, the interruption potential, the expectation that we might be interrupted. And some of them were suggesting that the readiness that we have to have our mind diverted at any moment, the interruption potential is taking a drain on our working memory as much as the actual activation of the interruption. And that was one of the things that they wanted to explore um, when they removed themselves completely from any electronic service out on the river. And so it really got me thinking about attention and how we can protect our attention as students, or let's say as more broadly as learners. I'm not a student right now, but I am a lifelong learner, and so I'm challenged to think how can I protect my attention? How can I give 100% of my focus to whatever I happen to be studying at any given moment? In an earlier video on good study habits, we looked at such habits as not cramming, because it's an inefficient way of using your mental resources, requiring way more time than spaced periods of learning. And we said that we can even reframe forgetting as a positive thing, because genuine memories and genuine learning is not based so much on what you learn as what you relearn after periods of forgetfulness. Because studies have shown that when you relearn something after a period of forgetfulness, it's solidified in the brain um, all the more than if there hadn't been a period of decreased retention. We also looked at the value of taking notes, even when materials are given to you in PDFs or videos. It's still helpful to take notes to cement the things you want to learn, because we interact with notes forces us to be active rather than merely passive in the information that we're taking in. We looked at how we can adopt a growth mindset, so that we see assignments and tests not as performance exercises to test how smart we are, but as invitations to growth. And getting plenty of sleep, because memories can be erased or can fail to solidify into schemas in the brain if we do not get enough um, proper sleep. And then turn off digital distractions. But as I said in my earlier video, turning off digital distractions really requires an entire lecture all of its own, which is the purpose of this presentation. But why a whole lecture on removing digital distractions? Well, because despite knowing how important attention is and focus, most of us don't actually understand it. We don't understand attention and focus, and therefore we don't understand about the boundaries we need for protecting our attention. And one example, and this was hinted at in some of the comments the neuroscientists made on the expedition, which we'll circle back to later, is that to protect our attention, it's not sufficient merely not to look at distractions. Rather, we need to remove the very possibility of digital distractions. Usually, that will mean actually removing your phone from proximity to where you are studying. And that is because of something called brain drain. Brain drain. The hypothesis that the researchers tossed around during the trip, that our working memory is compromised by constant availability, constant readiness to be interrupted, that has now been established by a string of clinical studies. For example, a 2023 study by Adrian Ward et al. Demonstrated that even when the phone does not interrupt sustained attention, and even when it does not increase the frequency of phone-related thoughts, the mere presence of the device is still adversely affects working memory capacity and functional fluid intelligence. A subsequent meta-analysis has supported the phenomenon of phone-induced brain drain, despite many remaining questions. And it all goes back to Dr. Yantis's comment during the trip about the expectation of messages. And now we could add not just messages, but the expectation of other forms of digital distraction. It seems that the presence of a phone keeps a person in a state of interruption readiness. Knowing that at any moment your attention might be pulled away from an activity, whether homework, conversation, a movie, project at work, or creative activities like listening to music or reading a novel or walking in nature. Knowing that at any time your attention could be diverted from those seems to stop a person from being able to fully engage in the task at hand, even if their subjective experience, subjective self-assessment is that they are fully attentive. The research seems to be suggesting that merely having that interruption potential available siphons the resources away from the working memory and thus diminishes, lessens the extent of us being fully engaged, or as fully engaged as we otherwise would be with the task at hand. If someone uses willpower to resist digital distractions, then the unread message or unviewed notification may undermine focus as severely as the brain drain experienced by someone who compulsively checks his or her phone. And this is because the cognitive drain of unsatiated curiosity, especially curiosity about stimuli that could be a source for either anxiety or excitement, however mild. We might compare this type of brain drain to a hungry person on a diet trying to read while there's a dish of chocolate within sight. Now, the deficits that this creates in working memory capacity and as well as functional fluid intelligence shouldn't be taken lightly, since these are the same systems involved in attentiveness, as well as deep thought, meaningful connection, mental adaptability, and abstract thinking, including the ability to make connections. Now, this research is challenging the popular tendency to think of distractions in purely quantitative terms. For example, as merely a time drain, merely something that uses up time. It may only take a split second to quickly glance at the incoming message or Instagram post during a conversation with a friend or while reading a book, especially if nothing relevant is communicated and especially if no follow-through is required. Yet the research increasingly suggests that the real issue is not quantitative in terms of time, but qualitative. Not time drain, but again, brain drain. And this is counterintuitive and somewhat even paradoxical to think that cognitive resources are siphoned away, not simply because of messages, alerts, and posts that we actually read, but the unread ones, the continual stream of information potential at our fingertips, always just a second away. It's like trying to do a hungry person trying to do mindfulness in front of the refrigerator. It doesn't matter whether you open the refrigerator and get food, it's still going to be a distraction. It's still going to undermine the working memory and the functional fluid intelligence. And the constant backdrop of potential stimulation, never mind actual stimulation, means that the silent spaces in our life rarely are able to reach deep silence. But deep silence is necessary for memory and learning. Memory and learning, for them to be for these activities to be effective, has to occur against a backdrop of deep silence and stillness. So there's a difference between learning and studying against a backdrop of stillness versus learning and studying against a backdrop of distraction or potential distraction. In the case of the latter, studying against a backdrop of distraction, the working memory is overloaded. And what happens when the working memory is overloaded with actual or potential distractions? That's a question that Nicholas Carr explored in his book, What the Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. And he showed that when our brains are bombarded with too much stimuli, some of the functions that get shut down include reduced long-term memory, erosion of conceptual and contextual thinking, reduced ability to grasp overarching narratives of meaning, the big picture, and that includes neurological schemas that we form when we sleep. But if during the day we are bombarded with too much information, then even if we get good quality sleep, the brain is not able to connect everything that we've learned into schemas as effectively. So during the day, it's very important not to let your working memory become oversaturated. And again, one of the ways that we can avoid this oversaturation is studying and learning against a backdrop of stillness rather than against a backdrop of actual or potential interruptions. Reduced ability to make connections between different facts and ideas. This is related to schemas that I mentioned before, and here we have it here, reduced ability to put knowledge into schemas. These are all some of the things that get shut down when our working memory is bombarded with too much stimuli. So this is as whether we're students or lifelong learners, this is something that we need to take very seriously, and we need to protect our attention from these types of liabilities. So why do so many of us remain tethered to constant digital noise, especially when we might just easily remove ourselves from a state of information potential by turning off our phone, by putting it in another room, by committing, okay, I'm not going to look at my phone until 4 o'clock or whatever, or putting it in the trunk of the car. There's all sorts of things you can do to remove not just actual interruptions, but even potential interruptions. Um, one of the things I do is I have all notifications turned off except the phone. So if there's an emergency and somebody rings, I'll be able to hear it. But if that's not enough, and I'm tempted to keep looking at my text messages to see if because I'm not going to hear it, I have to actually look. So whether it's social media or text messages or whatever, if it's becoming a problem, I lock it in a case safe device, a box that I have, and I'll put the timer on for an hour or whatever, however long I need to study, and then I've removed the potential distraction. So there are a lot of best practices for digital boundaries, and yet one of the reasons that we don't avail ourselves of these practices is because we are addicted to remaining in a state of interruption readiness. We're addicted to the possibility of digital noise, to remaining in that condition of interruption potential. Even though we may think it's uncomfortable to know that at any moment we might be interrupted, there's a deep primal part of ourselves that wants to remain available to interruption. And if we understand a bit about addiction, we can know why this is. Now, in her excellent book, Dopamine Nation, Dr. Anna Lembke from Stanford, she suggests that a hallmark of addictive and pre-addictive behaviors is any activity or behavior that, though it may at one time have offered substantial pleasure, must be continually repeated merely for the individual to feel normal. So maybe at one time something gave you a great pleasure, but it has to be continually repeated or used merely to feel normal. Now, if we're honest, that's most of us with regard to digital distractions. Most of us require access to digitally mediated messages and information merely to feel normal, which is why we find it difficult to turn off our phones or to put them on airplane mode for even an hour. Now, the key idea here is access. For even if we are not actively using our devices, we normally still remain accessible to incoming stimuli in the forms of alerts, status updates, dings for emails and messages, and so forth. And these interruptions excite the pleasure pathways in the hunter-gatherer brain, because we, even living in the 21st century, we still have a hunter-gatherer brain. And that means our brain is wired to remain alert to anything that could be useful or novel or unexpected, anything that could excite outrage or danger or anxiety or nourishment, social nourishment. The hunter-gatherer brain is wired to remain alert to anything that could stimulate us through through, as I said, anything that could be useful, novel, unexpected, etc. And so, and in our hunter-gatherer past, um, this this brain had great survival value, but it becomes maladaptive at a time of information surplus. And but what that means, and this is where it relates to addiction, to remove access to digital interruptions, for example, by silencing interruptions, removing our phone, putting it on airplane mode, whatever boundaries you may use, those boundaries can throw us into a dopamine deficit state, which is to say a form of mental pain. We no longer feel normal, and there's a slight mental pain at removing access to information potential, to the interruption readiness. Consider further how information readiness follows the same variable reinforcement schedule as slot machines. Even if only 1 in every 20 interruptions offers the type of social nourishment we crave, still, the mere availability to be interrupted is linked to the potential for dopamine. But unlike classic addictive activities like a slot machine where an individual activates the stimulus, for example, by pulling the lever, the smartphone user is passive, so that even silence becomes subliminally stimulating because the user knows that at any moment the silence could be broken by the pleasure stimulus. And the occasionally rewarding moments of digital interruptions mixed with unrewarding or irritating ones compel us to keep returning and to remain available, even at times when such availability is clearly antithetical to our health or to the health of our loved ones. For example, while driving or sleeping, or even while nursing infants or right after intimacy. If silence if I silence or remove my phone while engaging in meaningful activities, then while the potential for interruptions are removed, so is the potential for dopaminergic distraction. Now, maybe you imagine you're an outlier and you can switch attention quickly between one thing and another. Or maybe you even suppose that attention switching increases your productivity. But multitasking, even when, perhaps especially when we're good at it, always comes at a cost. Earl Miller, professor of neuroscience at MIT, says that switch cost, which is the loss of attention when we're pulled away from a task, even if only for a split second to glance at the message, it has the effect on the brain's ability to focus that lasts up to 15 or 20 minutes. The worst effects of switch costs occur in the first 64 seconds after checking one's email or text messages, regardless of whether or not there was a message of significance. And I imagine the same is true of social media. We're looking at social media, although I don't have data on that. And what's also interesting is that in pilot data presented at TEDx, David Strayer, the man who organized the kayaking trip, he found that there was a 20-minute technology hangover among subjects who walked in nature while using their phone compared to subjects who walked without a device. Let's hear what he said about this fascinating experiment.
Our short-term studies involved having people walk in an arboretum in Salt Lake City. And we recorded electrical signals from their brain, EEG, as they went on the walk, both before and after the walk. One group was asked to give us all their technology before the walk. They had no phones, no cameras, no digital music. The other group We asked them to use their cell phone to talk to a friend or a relative when they were on the walk. When we looked at the EEG, we focused on the theta frequencies in the EEG. Those signals are specifically linked to the anterior cingulate cortex, and that's a part of the brain that's important for coordinating multitasking activities. When we looked at those signals, we found really stunning differences. On the left, what you see on the left over here is you see the brain activity of the group that didn't have any technology. The green shows low levels of theta activity, suggesting that their brains were rested from the walk. On the right, you see the brain activity of the group who is using their cell phone. We see that that red indicates their brains are still active from all that multitasking. Importantly, these signals were recorded 20 minutes after the walk, suggesting that there's a technology hangover of sorts from all that multitasking. And not only were there differences in brain activity, but the people who were using their cell phone could only remember half of what they saw compared to the group who didn't have the cell phone, wasn't using the technology. So these multitasking was creating a form of inattentional blindness where people failed to notice things in plain sight. Now you might be wondering, are these differences just due to being outdoors? And we know there's more than just exercise because both groups walked for the same amount of time. We know that exercise is important for improving cognitive function and promoting neurogenesis. But to get the full restorative benefits, you need to leave the technology behind.
Wow, I found that very, very interesting as a nature lover and a hiker. Um, yeah, and I understand about brain mapping and EEGs because I used to have a type of therapy that neurotherapy biofeedback. The long version is neuropsychophysiology and biofeedback. I had I had um, brain fatigue, very bad brain fog because of high theta waves. And so as they did this neurotherapy and biofeedback, every couple of months they would do EEGs on my brain to see how it was how it was working. So anyway, just the aside, I found it interesting that the subjects who had walked in the presence of their phone showed very very high theta waves in their frontal cortex. I'd encourage you to watch that whole TED talk. He talks as well about the expedition on the San Juan River. Um, so bottom line, if you're on your phone the entire time that you're hiking or walking or even just sitting in nature, you're robbing yourself of the restorative functions that you could be experiencing from from the natural world around you. I would go even further. Because the brain regions that regulate attention are the same systems that are involved in critical thinking, problem solving, and impulse control, when we weaken these networks through a lifestyle of multitasking, we may be inadvertently nudging ourselves toward various maladaptive conditions, including anxiety and low impulse control. After all, impulse control depends on rejecting interference from irrelevant stimuli, whether the stimuli is arising internally from one's emotions, passions, and mental representations, or arising from an external source. A person who has control over his or her attention can nip negative cognitions in the bud before they mature into full-fledged anxiety or chaos. But attention isn't just how we weed out what's negative. Through the gift of our attention, we preserve the things we love. If there's something you care deeply about, whether it's succeeding as a student or a hobby, a type of music, or even a spouse, you will need attention to protect that. Yet, if we allow our offline activities to be punctuated by digital interruptions, including merely interruption potential, then we risk diluting the quality of our experiences through habituating ourselves to a condition of continuous partial attention and never being fully engaged and never 100% present. All right, so I'd like us to now try to pull some of these threads together and just to reflect what all of this information means to us in our experience as students. And to help us with that, I'd like to go back to that kayaking trip out in the wilderness 15 years ago. Here are some pictures. Here's Arthur Kramer sitting and enjoying being peaceful for maybe one of the first times in his career. No digital interruptions. Here are the scientists sitting around in the evening debating and hypothesizing and exploring about the brain. It was just very creative. It was a very creative experience for all of them. But I wanted to know what what do they think looking back 15 years later? We have so much more information now about the brain, about how our brain interacts with the world and with our devices, with multitasking. And so I was intrigued if they might have um, different or more mature perspectives now. So I phoned up Dr. David Strayer, who's still at the University of Utah, and he's now a professor of cognition and neuroscience. So when I spoke to him, Strayer told me that his lab has, in the 15 years since that expedition, his lab has undertaken a plethora of studies to identify brain-based measures of cognitive restoration. And great outdoorsman as he is, he's been particularly intrigued by the restorative effects of time in nature. In study after study, he and his colleagues have proved that they proved the benefits of time in nature, and those benefits include enhanced creativity, better attention, improved working memory, and healthier functioning in the brain regions associated with emotional regulation. And I asked him what his thoughts were today on the phenomenon of interruption potential. The mere presence of your phone, he said, especially if it's starting, this is a quote from our phone call, especially if it's starting to go off and so forth, even if you're not interacting with it, leads to the thought, is that my phone? And he explained that a person habituated to these types of distractions may experience interruption potential even after the phone has been removed. And he said that during the 2010 hiking trip, some of the other scientists were experiencing phantom vibrations in their pockets, even though their um, phones had been left back at the base. Um, and I asked if he had any different perspectives now, 10 years, um, 15 years later. Um, And he said, I wish, this is a quote, I wish I knew then what I know now about what the science has discovered over the last 15 or 20 years, because I would have been able to answer the skeptics. We haven't answered all the questions, but now there is an abundance of research. 15 years ago, there was a debate about whether you could become addicted to this technology. But now, years later, moving forward, there is pretty clear consensus that it can be a behavioral addiction with all sorts of negatives. The message isn't that technology is bad, but that if we are unwise in how we use it, then our social interactions suffer, as do our cognitions and creativity. End of quote. So, is there a solution to our addiction to interruption potential, to being constantly available to be distracted. Because remember, we saw that information readiness, interruption readiness, knowing that at any moment our focus could be diverted away from the task at hand. Um, Even though that's annoying, it's also addicting. It's very hard to completely remove not only distractions, but even potential distractions. Um, because it's hard because of the way information readiness um, works on the neuromechanisms similarly to slot machines. Now, not all of us can unplug and go on a 5-day wilderness expedition, but we can carve out little spaces of wilderness in our lives, times of quiet where we can slow down and embrace stillness, removing the continual stream of information potential that's just at our fingertips. And the research suggests that this stillness might be easier to access than we realize, as it could simply involve removing one's phone from one's presence for periods of time, or turning off the features that keep us tethered to a condition of interruption readiness. For example, I have all notifications turned off apart from phone call. If somebody, I can hear somebody phones me, and sometimes I can still go and see if there's messages or if I had social media on my phone, even even if I don't get notifications, I can go open up Instagram or whatever. And so sometimes merely turning off interruptions isn't enough. I need something more. And so I this might seem like a drastic solution, but I bought a K-safe device, and I will lock my phone in here if I'm trying to read or study or pray or whatever, and I keep having that sense of interruption readiness. Oh, I go get out my phone and go see if anybody's replied to me or whatever. It's like, okay, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to have the cognitive drain of having to use willpower, because willpower siphons off resources that could be used for creativity. So I'll lock my phone in this box, and once it's locked, once I've selected the time and and press go, um, it's impossible to access apart from breaking into it, which I don't have the tools to do. But I could still be distracted by my computer, assuming that I'm not using the computer. So I have this briefcase. I put my laptop in here, and then I lock it with keys. I have some keys that lock it, and then I'll put the keys in the K-safe device with the phone. And that might seem like a bit over the top, but it's no different than how we've come to approach food. As a species, we haven't fully adapted to food surpluses, and so the food surpluses of the agricultural revolution we're still trying to adapt to, and we have the obesity crisis because as a species we still haven't learned how to exist in a condition of food surplus. Similarly, we are still adapting to the information surplus wrought by the digital revolution. And so just like food surplus leads to obesity, information surplus leads to a range of attention disorders, and um, it amplifies things like low impulse control and the trouble focusing, and the various things that we've explored in this lecture. And so the just like with food, we realize that yeah, even though there's the refrigerator over there, even though I have access to food, I can wait until the next meal. Just because I'm hungry doesn't mean I necessarily need to go and snack. And similarly, we're coming to realize that even though digital stimulation may be only a click away, we need to take measures to protect our attention, to preserve silence, and to limit the availability of digital distractions. I have one friend who keeps his phone in the trunk of his car. Um, for um, for most of the time, merely putting our phone on airplane mode will be sufficient to remove information potential, interruption potential. Find the sort of boundaries that work well for you, and and especially as a student. So let's think now about what all of this means to our experience as students. Now, most of the applications are already obvious based on what we've covered so far. We've talked about removing interruption potential. And this is especially important as a student because you don't want your functional intelligence and your working memory compromised by too much stimuli. You want you want the brain to be able to have the type of attention um, that that will be able to solidify into schemas and memories when you sleep. Um, and if if you use social media, that's fine, but have set times for it. Don't have social media open when you're studying. And I would even say right before or right after. Um, right after studying, you want to let the material solidify in your memory. So don't just go on your phone right after, like, oh, I'm taking a break from my studies, so I'm going to study for 25 minutes, then go check my phone, then study for another 25 minutes. You're just setting yourself up for the type of switch cost that we talked about earlier in the brain drain. Um, and um, let's see what's the next. Yeah, make your digital interface into a single channel device. So if you're using your computer to study, or if you're using your phone to study, say you're listening to online lectures or whatever, make it into a single channel device. Turn off everything else. And I would even say when you're doing recreational activities with a digital interface, to also make it into a single channel device. So if you're watching TV or playing a computer game, focus your attention on that and have a good time. Don't allow your entertainment um, to be punctuated by by interruption potential and so forth. If you're like there's a time even your studies, like when you're having times of recreation, stop thinking about your studies. Don't look at your college email and so forth, so that you can give your attention to whatever you're focused on at the time. Um, I do this with audiobooks. If I'm listening to an audiobook, I'll have everything else turned off so that I can just really immerse myself in the experience. And in this way, you can actually leverage your devices to strengthen your attention. Um, the devices are not bad, and they can actually be used to strengthen your attention when you make them into single channel devices. Um, Instead of letting them scatter your focus and habituate you into a condition of continuous partial attention. And of course, spend time in nature. That's very important as a student to take care of yourself. And sometimes as students, we can get stressed. This is especially true for students who are also parents and or students who have a full-time job. So we can get stressed and suffer from anxiety. And going out in nature and having times of or having times of stillness, mindfulness, meditation, and so forth. This is not just a concession to our tendency for stress and anxiety. This is actually central to learning because it's in times of quiet, especially times in nature, um, serve as incubation periods for higher cognition and as well as for memory and learning. So take time, even if it's just 10 minutes, to go outside and notice the trees. When I have time, I'll drive over to some of the nature areas in my town, and I'll go for a walk barefoot. Maybe we don't have time for that, but even if you just have 5 or 10 minutes to step outside and listen to the birds and look at the trees, we know that being in nature has a restorative function. Well, that's all for today's video. I hope it's been helpful. I could have just said, um, don't let yourself be distracted. But I think it's very important to understand the neuromechanisms that are involved, especially when it comes to interruption potential, which is something that we tend not to think about as much. So I really wanted to, as it were, marinate you in some of the science, so that you can start working with the way your brain was designed, rather than putting yourself in situations where your memory and learning and even intelligence is being compromised. So thank you for your attention, and may your studies be successful.